'Tis the season for candy canes and reindeers. But how about a candy cane reindeer? I've done yellow and purple, and blue and orange. But the last two colors on the color wheel that are contrasting for my contrast challenge are green and red, which I reckon makes this the perfect time of year to finish this challenge off. You can check out the past videos for the challenge up here, but let's go over the rules anyway. In this challenge, I'm allowed the use of white and black, since those are technically tones, not hues, and any red or green in my collection. However, since learning a lot more about paint and pigment this year, I've discovered that a lot of green paints are all just blends of phthalo green blue shade or PG7. Usually they're just phthalo green mixed with phthalo blue, or yellow oxide, or some siennas, which I kind of feel is against the spirit of the challenge since those all have something other than green or red. Most other green pigments don't get used in miniature paints simply because they're not safe for airbrush use, and since I want to be genuine, this will be the only green I'll be using. Though there are a couple other pigments that would be safe to work with, this is the only one I have. As for the reds, I do have a lot more options on that side of things. Not only do I have bright reds like these ones, but I also get some dark reds like these red oxides from Liquitex and Chimera. And lastly, crimson colors, which are more on the magenta side of things, but clearly marked as red pigments, so if the art world isn't going to make the distinction, neither am I. I like to start off all these challenges by mixing up the colors together and see exactly what kind of shades I can get, though this one is going to depend heavily on how much green or red is in each. As with a perfect mix between the two, I could even end up with black. What I'll be looking for is a brown of some kind I can lighten and use for the fur. Since I have the red oxides, I can do red leathers with those, but I want to make sure it stands out different from the fur color. Phthalo green has a very high tinting strength, which means I'm not going to use too much to start. The red oxides with the green prove to have some nice brown potential. If anything, I'll be able to get a good variety for the leather. The quote, normal reds seem to morph into the oxides with the green added, but the Chimera color red goes a bit more brown, so I probably have a good contender for my fur. The crimsons, the reds on the magenta side of things, mixed with green actually come out a bit more purple in a way, which may be good to give me some variety or a nice hue shift when shading the green, since I will want some plain green to feature on the model too. So what did I mean by candy cane reindeer at the start? Well, the model I'm going to use for this challenge is actually going to be from the group of these folk beastmen from Titanforge. Their large antlers and folk-like clothing I think will actually do well with a red, white, and green scheme, if I can do it realistically enough. I don't want them to actually look like a candy cane, but just hint at those colors. Because I get the use of white for this challenge, I'm going to make their fur a light gray, but start with some brown shades instead of just going black to white. From the testing, I think I like the mix of green and the Chimera color red the best, so once I have a nice ratio between the two, I mix in some white ink and load it into the airbrush to get my base coat down. Being that it's close to a neutral gray tone, it's not really going to be that different to my primer layer, so I don't care where I get this, as long as it covers the fur. I'm going to stick with the airbrush for now and just load in a bit more white with the base color I was using. With this, I'll aim more at the raised edges where the fur would be lighter based on the light reflections. Once the spraying is done, I make the same mix on the palette and use a fine brush to then pick out strands of fur everywhere, creating the maximum highlight for the shade areas, so I'll still have the texture when it comes to the shade layer. Even though there is sculpted fur, I do this because it'll give the illusion of even more fur there than what was sculpted. For the last highlight, since it's white fur, I'm just adding more white, using white ink since I feel it's a much more transparent white, even though it's the same pigments as all the other whites. There's just less of them, so it doesn't change a mix too drastically when moving up in whiteness. I don't want to go up to a full white because I think then we'll be in the danger zone of him actually looking like a candy cane, so a dusky white gray is what I'm aiming for. With this, I'm doing fur texture strokes again, but only in the areas I highlighted with the airbrush a few steps ago. We'll be doing more in the shadows, so there will be more contrast later, but not too much. Last thing to do is going to be to add some of that dusk into the shadows. So I mix up some of that crimson red into the original mix to see if I can't get some of that purple in there with something a little more smoky looking. And also make sure it's not too dark by adding a bit of white if needed. Even though these are in the shadows, I don't want that much overall contrast. This gets loaded into the airbrush, then sprayed under the knees and along the back and undersides of the fur. Just a little bit of hue shift is all I want, so keep it pretty sparing and thin. Well, that was the last thing to do, but when I was looking at the end product, it wasn't actually white enough overall. It had the highlights, but still felt like those areas weren't light enough. Also, I'm aware I missed the tail. Dope. So I loaded some of that highlight mix into the airbrush just to do a light airbrush highlight on those areas again, and as long as I'm not too heavy-handed, the fur texture should still show through. He has some really interesting leg and hand armor, which is what the oxides are going to be for. I'll use the Chimera Red Oxide for this one, since I think it's a bit more on the red side, but I'll add a bunch of black to darken it to start, since I want to try something from other painters I've been watching. Just a base coat of this over the whole thing. For the next color, it's just going to be the red on its own, with a bit of the darker red mixed in again, so it's not too much of a difference. Then with this, I'm going to prep the stippling by drawing circles around each of the studs found around the leather armor. This way, with that guide, I should be able to stay away from them and keep a nice dark outline around them. When it comes to the stippling itself, I'll go around and between the studs to stipple all around the leather, but do my personal best to keep it sparing, which is something I don't have the best ability at. I do get heavy-handed with a lot of these things, but I'm going to do my best to just give marks and scratches, but leave more of that dark layer in between. The reason for that is because I'm going to thin down the color I was using even more now, so it's a bit more opaque, and start to stipple with that. This stippling layer though only goes to where I want the lightest areas to be, so it does double duty of adding a second coat to the first stippling layer, but also lightening up the dark base layer in the highlighted areas. Time to get some other colors in here, and I'm going to start with Liquitex Red Oxide. It's a bit lighter and more on the orange side of red, so it will be a nice highlight for scratches and textures in the leather all on its own, though we always have the white to add after to push that even further. I'll do with this what I did with the original red. Outline studs in the area I plan to place it, then lightly stipple around them in the area I made lighter with the last color. Just a few dabs of the paint here and there, then thinned out for some more, I guess we can call this stipple glazing. I have to save the combo of white and Liquitex Red Oxide for the ropes, because it's the only thing I think will stand out enough. But I'll put a bit of white in just to get some nice random light scratches in a few heavy use areas of all the leather parts. Also, much later on when painting other things, I realized that this is far too orange to be considered candy cane, but still red enough that we're not in the tropical orange area either. So to remedy this, I'm just going to thin down one of the standard reds, this one the Scale Artist Primary Red, and with a very thin glazing, just turn the orange towards the red a little bit more in these light areas that seem a bit more orange. I think the green I'll keep to my original, more familiar style, but set up my base shade and highlight on the palette to start. As I hinted at before, I want to use the magenta reds with the green to get a nice purple start to the green cloak and loincloth. So with some of the green, I'll mix in a bit of crimson in order to get my base shade. For a medium shade, I want green so I can just use a phthalo green, though it might be a bit too dark as a medium shade, so add the tiniest bit of white. Then for a highlight, just a tiny bit more white. If I go overboard, he is going to look too neon, which I don't want, on the cloth anyway, so I'll keep the green relatively dark overall. I'm a bit worried about the opacity of the green and crimson over the gray starting point. Since they're both pretty transparent colors separately, I don't think they'll be that much better together either. So I'm actually going to start with filling in some parts black, the cloak for one, but while I'm at it, I'll also get the rope and knickknacks that hang off his body, as well as the weapon in its entirety. Now that I have a solid base to work from, I just need to apply that purpley green base to it to get started. A full coverage of this, though I anticipate it to be quite dark once it dries thanks to the black layer I put under it. The other purpose of this black undercoat is to also get a lot of the lining done, so I'm actually not trying to get it as tight to parts that touch the cloak, like the stones and his hair, so I won't have to come back to line them later. All that hard work was done last step. From here it'll be a process of steps up in color, but steps down in coverage, and I'll mix my colors to get each of those steps too. I find the best way to work with triads is to actually mix between them each step so that each layer has some of the previous layer in it, just so I'm not accidentally stepping too far towards a tone that will be harder to bring back and blend once I've finished it. In the last step, it was my mid-green with the dark green added. In this step, I just go with the mid-green, starting to introduce more of those green pigments in here. Since I mix these myself, the pigments aren't any different, just crimson, green, and white in different volumes. But by doing it this way, I always preserve some volume so that no one step is ever too much of a jump, which is how you can get a nice blend through just layering. And if you have a triadic paint system, it can be a good way of getting into the habit of painting with mixes instead of just using what comes in the bottle. After the medium mix comes the medium mix and the light mix combined. There should still be a little bit of the base mix somewhere in this though. It won't be a lot, just enough to give it a tiny color difference. I'm also using this layer to really pick out the difference between light and dark to get a nice contrast, filling in a lot of the area still, but mostly only the upper folds that face upwards. The last layer is just a light edge highlight of the green, but instead of following the flow of the garment folds, I'll instead paint small lines across it to give it a more fabric look. Sometimes, when the blends are too good, things that wouldn't look smooth at all can look too uniform on the miniature. So a bit of texture like this will make it look a bit more real, but it doesn't take too much more work. Only a few more bits and pieces to go now, and I'll be starting with the rope. This one's pretty simple and only a few steps, starting with some pure Liquitex red oxide, which, like I said earlier, is more on the orange side of red, but it is still made up of Pigment Red 101, just giving the ropes a base coat of this, but leaving the black in gaps between the rope and other objects, but not between themselves. And because this is a base coat, I'll do it a couple times or more until it's one solid opaque layer. I just add a bit of white to the red oxide from my next step up in color. This might come out a little more like a skin tone if I don't add anything else, so also just a tiny bit of green to keep it from going that direction. With this mix, I pick out all the strands of rope. This might be a tedious step, but since I'm only doing about 3 layers total, one step of tedium is probably acceptable overall. Last will just be to mix in a bit more of that white to get my highlight, and once again with this, pick out strands of the rope, but only in the areas that need some highlights, so not nearly as bad as the last layer, since it should only be in a few places anyway, whereas Belly pushes and rounds them out a bit, and just a few spots on the ones on his loincloth. He has a lot of fancy stone-carved runes around his cloak and chest, and I want to make them look a little magical and festive at the same time. So we're going to make them glow with our colors of the day, red and green, which is where we're going to actually start this as well, with a mix of crimson and green again, but this time a little black gets added to it, and then white to form another mix. Each stone then gets a half and half paint job. Top half gets the black, and the bottom half the lighter mix. Once it dries, I'm going to create a blend between those where they meet up in the middle of each stone, with a little wet blending, taking the lighter gray onto my brush, then just dabbing a bit of the dark mix onto the tip. Because I used ivory black for it, black shouldn't overpower that much and create a nice transition from dark to medium. To prepare for the glow, I'm going to use some white ink and matte medium to fill the runes that I want to glow, since both the red and green will just show up better over white. It's best to do this now than to worry about it later and try and get past the edges. This way we get our glow first and can edge highlight the edges after. Once the white's dry, I do the same thing again, but this time with some green added to the white, and just the red on its own, alternating runes between the colors. Now that the lights are in place, I want to get to the highlights. For this, I just add more white to the medium gray mix, and it can actually go on pretty bright. because the way this is going to work is to actually highlight the edges around the stone and the runes, catching only the upper edges for the most part, but all the way around the rune as a whole. Since the bottom half is technically our brightest point on these, I can do a bit of stippling with this color on the bottom to give it that stone texture. Lastly, I want to go in with the pure white again, this time to highlight the runes and the top edges of the stones. Because the runes are already bright, this is pretty much the only color I can use to highlight them. The idea is that on the bottom edge of the rune, anything pointing up is where I want to paint white, and also the points around the stone that would be the brightest on the top edge. When I think antlers and hooves, I think bone, but there just isn't any way I'm going to get a bone color without some yellow. And since the metals are going to have to be my gray color, I can't go with that. So I'm thinking my best bet is to mix up as close to a chromatic black as I can, to then mix from like a gray, but it won't look identical to black pigment and white. And to do that, I go back and forth between Chimera Red and the Phthalo Green until it looks black. Of course, I want the horns to have a bit of a gradient from dark at the base to light at the tips, but with all the leather wrapped around them, it might actually be easier than having to blend over the whole thing. I start by making mixes with varying amounts of white from the chromatic black I made. Then starting with the darkest, I'll base the lower horns with that. Then base a little further up the horn with the next shade, and so on until I'm at a pretty bright spot on the tip of the horns. And since it's a base coat, of course I do a couple of layers. At this point, I've got some of my blend points covered up by the leather, so like I said, less work. But any that aren't, I'm going to have to give them a little wet blend, the same way I did with the stone runes. Just the lighter color in my brush, the darker color on the tip, and blend out the gap between them. I dread the idea of painting in the little cuticles along the horns with a black line, because the roundness of them will just make angles really weird to get at. So though I haven't done it much, I think a wash is in order. And since I'm allowed a black, that's what I'm going to wash it with, though a little thinned down. I'll cover the whole horn with the wash, but make sure it pools at the base and around the leather the most, since this is more about the lines than it is fading anything. Heading back to the paint, I'll go to my brightest gray and add in just a little more white. With this, I can do the final highlighting, and while I skipped doing the wash lining, I don't think I'll have a shortcut with this one. So lucky for me, it's at least not over the whole horn, just the tips and a bit of stippling a little bit down them for some texture to go along with the veins of black that now run throughout. For the hooves, I'm just going to be using the same colors, but just layering them with a striated pattern. So start with a chromatic black, then form the pattern with the next layer, and just fill it in less and less from there with each other color. So now there's just lots of little things to do that I don't want to take too much time on, but want to make sure you see the mixes so you know I'm not cheating in any way. For the wood on the weapon, it's going to be a desaturated Chimera Red oxide, made with black and white for the gray, then just adding the oxide until I like where the tint's at. I paint that as the base coat, and because of all that black and white in there, it only needs one coat. Then I give it a glaze with just the red oxide and the black thinned down. For the wood highlights, I add some white to the original base mix and pick out all the raised edges of the wood. And for the final touch, a second glaze near the lines where the woods, metals, and leathers all meet to give it a nice lining and make sure it still has some saturation. For the metals, it's just going to be black and white. No color here, at least not right away. I'll start from a dark gray to give it an overall base coat. Once again, this pretty much only needs one layer, though I did want a bit of blend in it, so did another layer of wet blending the black at the base and into the gray at the top, and also lined all the sculpted scratches with some pure black while I was there too. With just some more white into the gray, I'm going to outline the whole blade, along the side and the middle edges. Then once I have those lines in, start to pick out where my highlights are going to be by filling those sections in with parallel lines. To blend, I just use the same gray, thin down into a glaze, then blend those lines out into the darkness around it a bit. Same idea again, but with a really light gray this time, trying to keep my lines thinner and shorter, but once again glazing them to get a gentle blend into them. Last layer is a pure white. For this one, I want the parallel lines to focus on the edges, then shrink the closer I get to the center, then widen out again towards the edges again. No need for a blend on this last layer either. Now I want to introduce some color again with some rust on the non-blade middle of it, which is why I left it blank in the last step. I'll add some Liquitex red oxide to black and stipple this in the center of the blade, and gradually just add more and more of the oxide red as I go, making the most corroded section of the blade near where it connected to the handle and the bolting apparatus of the handle as well. Last thing to do was the mouth and eyes, which were just normal red and white to get pinks for the inside of the mouth and tongue, and to do some of the leather I missed earlier in the same way I did it before. This one was a challenge and a half. Unlike blue and orange and yellow and purple, there wasn't a whole lot of colors you can make from red and green. And if it wasn't for red oxides counting as reds, he may as well have looked a little more like a candy cane. But I'm quite happy how the festive realism turned out in the end. And while the fur seems a bit more pink now, with all the other colors filled in, I somehow don't mind that at all. And even if I had access to all the other colors, I feel like all I'd really need is a good brown and not really change much else at all. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.